In the cold, thin air high above Europe, the Second World War was being decided in a place no army could reach. Thousands of meters above the ground, massive bomber formations carved slow, deliberate paths through the sky, carrying the war directly into the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. At the center of this airborne offensive flew one aircraft that would become a legend, the B-17 Flying Fortress. Its appearance alone inspired awe and fear, a wide-winged machine of aluminum and engines, bristling with guns, moving with steady determination through flak-filled skies. The B-17 was designed for a mission that no previous aircraft had been expected to survive. It was built to fly deep into enemy territory, far beyond the protection of friendly fighters, and still bring its crew home. German airspace was one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, packed with anti-aircraft guns and enemy interceptors waiting to tear bombers apart. Yet the Flying Fortress went there again and again, carrying bombs that could cripple factories, railways, and fuel plants, the vital organs of Hitler's war machine. Inside the aircraft, 10 men lived and fought as one. Pilots wrestled the heavy bomber through turbulence and violent evasive maneuvers. Navigators and bombardiers stared through fogged glass and complicated instruments, calculating paths and targets, while explosions shook the airframe. Gunners watched the skies in every direction, knowing that enemy fighters could appear at any moment. The roar of the engines never stopped. The freezing cold crept into their bones. Fear was always present. But so was duty. What made the B-17 different was not just its size or its payload, but its ability to survive punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft. Stories spread through the airfields of bombers, returning with holes torn through their wings, sections of fuselage missing, and engines shot to pieces, yet still flying. To the men who depended on it, the Flying Fortress felt less like a machine and more like a guardian, holding together just long enough to bring them back from the edge of death. Above Europe, the B-17 became more than a bomber. It became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and relentless pressure from the sky. And as long as its steel wings kept beating through the clouds, the outcome of the war would never be the same. The B-17 was not created as a graceful flying machine. It was engineered as a weapon of survival. American designers understood from the beginning that bombers over Europe would face an environment more hostile than anything aviation had ever known. German fighters would attack in waves, and anti-aircraft guns would fill the sky with steel. To endure this, the Flying Fortress had to be strong, redundant, and brutally practical in every detail. Its structure was built around a rigid aluminum frame that could absorb damage without collapsing. Critical systems were duplicated so that if one was destroyed, another might still function. Fuel tanks were designed to seal themselves when hit, reducing the chance of fire. Control cables ran through multiple routes, giving pilots a chance to keep flying even after severe damage. Every design choice was made with one question in mind. What happens when the bullets start hitting? Firepower was the heart of the fortress. The aircraft carried heavy .50 caliber machine guns placed so that no angle of attack was left undefended. Gunners could engage fighters approaching from the front, rear, above, or below. When B-17s flew in formation, these overlapping fields of fire created a deadly barrier of bullets that German pilots had to cross to reach their targets. Attacking a Flying Fortress formation meant flying straight into a storm of metal. But strength alone was not enough. The B-17 also had to fly higher than most enemy fighters, above much of the flak, where the air was thin and unforgiving. At these altitudes, engines struggled, oxygen was scarce, and the cold was deadly. Yet this height gave the bombers a crucial advantage, allowing them to reach deep into Germany while still maintaining some measure of protection. The result was an aircraft unlike any the world had seen. It was not fast, it was not elegant, but it was stubbornly hard to kill. Every rivet, every gun mount, every armored plate existed for one purpose: to cap the bomber in the air long enough to complete its mission. And in the skies over Europe, that stubborn resilience would become one of the most important weapons of the war. Behind the metal skin of every B-17 were 10 men whose lives depended on one another in ways few people could ever imagine. Each mission began long before the aircraft left the runway, as crews studied maps, weather reports, and target photographs, knowing that hours later they would be flying into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Once airborne, there was no escape. If the aircraft was damaged, if someone was wounded, if the engines began to fail, they would have to solve the problem in the sky. Inside the flying fortress, space was tight and movement was difficult. Crew members crawled through narrow passages between compartments while wearing heavy flight suits, parachutes, and oxygen masks. Communication was shouted through intercoms distorted by engine noise. At high altitude, the cold was so intense that exposed skin could freeze in seconds, and metal surfaces burned like ice. Even simple tasks became exhausting under these conditions. The psychological strain was just as brutal. Crews watched other bombers around them explode or fall away in flames, knowing that their own aircraft could be next. German fighters attacked with deadly precision, while flak bursts shook the B-17 like a hammer striking glass. Yet despite the chaos, each man had to remain focused on his job. Gunners tracked targets through shaking sights. Pilots held formation so the bombs could be dropped accurately. Navigators recalculated courses as winds shifted and damage altered the aircraft's behavior. Trust bound these men together. A pilot trusted his gunners to protect the aircraft. A gunner trusted the pilot to keep them alive. A bombardier trusted the entire crew to hold steady when the bombs were released. In this fragile flying world, a single mistake could doom them all. The flying fortress was a marvel of engineering, but it was the courage and discipline of its crews that turned it into a legend. Without them, it would have been nothing more than aluminum and guns falling through the sky. Every B-17 mission was a journey into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. As the bombers crossed the European coastline and pushed deeper into enemy territory, the skies ahead grew darker with danger. German radar stations tracked their approach. Fighter bases scrambled interceptors. Anti-aircraft batteries prepared their guns. Long before the first bomb was dropped, the battle had already begun. Flak shells burst in the air around the formations, throwing black clouds of steel fragments in every direction. These explosions were not random. They were carefully calculated to detonate at the altitude where the bombers flew, tearing through wings, fuselages, and engines. A single hit could cripple a plane or kill a crew member instantly. Yet the formations pressed on, holding their tight patterns so that their defensive fire remained effective. Then the fighters arrived. German pilots attacked from every angle, diving through the bomber formations at high speed, while cannons and machine guns ripped into aluminum skins. Some aimed for engines, others targeted cockpits or tail gunners. The sky became a chaos of smoke, fire, and tracer rounds. Through it all, the B-17s continued forward, their gunners firing back with everything they had. Reaching the target was only half the battle. To drop bombs accurately, the formation had to fly straight and level for several critical moments, making them perfect targets for both flak and fighters. Crews knew that these seconds were the most dangerous of the entire mission, yet they held their course, trusting in their aircraft and in each other. When the bombs finally fell, they carried the war directly into the factories, rail yards, and refineries that kept Germany fighting. The flying fortress was not just surviving in the sky, it was changing the war on the ground, one mission at a time. For all its strength and firepower, the B-17 did not make its crews invincible. The skies over Europe were littered with the wreckage of flying fortresses that never returned. Early in the bombing campaign, losses were catastrophic. Entire formations were torn apart by fighters and flak, and airfields in England filled with empty bunks and silent hangars where aircraft should have been. The American strategy of daylight precision bombing depended on the belief that heavily armed bombers could fight their way through enemy defenses. In theory, the B-17s would protect one another with overlapping fire. In reality, German pilots quickly learned how to exploit weaknesses in the formations. They attacked from head-on angles where fewer guns could reach them, and they used powerful cannons that could destroy a bomber with a single hit. Crews felt the cost of these battles every time they took off. They knew the statistics. Many would not survive the required number of missions to go home. Each flight might be their last. And yet, day after day, the flying fortresses rose into the cold sky again, carrying men who understood the risk, but flew anyway. The turning point came with the arrival of long-range fighter escorts. When aircraft like the P-51 Mustang began accompanying the bombers all the way to their targets, the balance of power in the air began to shift. German fighters were forced to fight for their own survival instead of freely attacking the bombers. Slowly, losses decreased. The skies became safer for the flying fortresses. The price paid for this dominance was enormous, but the result was decisive. With control of the air, the Allies could strike Germany's war industry at will. The B-17, battered but unbroken, had helped win the skies, and with them, the war itself. As the B-17 fleets grew stronger and better protected, their impact on Germany became devastating. Bombing raids were no longer isolated strikes, but a relentless campaign that ground the Nazi war economy down piece by piece. Factories that produced aircraft, tanks, and ammunition were hit again and again. Oil refineries that fueled the German military were reduced to smoking ruins. Rail yards and bridges that kept supplies moving were torn apart from the air. The flying fortress became a weapon of industrial destruction. It was not designed to win battles directly, but to destroy the enemy's ability to fight. Every bomb dropped was aimed at the heart of Germany's capacity to wage war. Without fuel, planes could not fly. Without factories, weapons could not be built. Without transportation, armies could not move. German civilians felt the pressure as well. Cities were shaken by explosions, and daily life became a struggle for survival. Air raid sirens, shelters, and ruined neighborhoods became part of the landscape. Morale suffered as the bombers returned again and again, seemingly unstoppable. At the same time, German defenses were stretched to the breaking point. Fighter units were forced to defend the homeland rather than support troops on the front lines. Anti-aircraft guns that could have been used elsewhere were tied down protecting cities and factories. The B-17s were not just destroying targets. They were forcing Germany to fight a defensive war in the sky. By the time Allied armies began advancing across Western Europe, the effects of the bombing campaign were clear. The German war machine was weakened, starved of resources, and struggling to recover. The flying fortress had done what it was built to do: break the enemy from the air. By 1944, the air war over Europe had changed completely. What had once been a deadly struggle for survival became a battle the Allies were increasingly winning. The B-17 formations, now protected by long-range fighters and supported by overwhelming numbers, moved across the sky with growing confidence. German interceptors still attacked, but they no longer ruled the air. This shift had enormous consequences. Allied bombers could now reach targets deep inside Germany with fewer losses. Entire regions of the Reich lay exposed to constant attack. Oil facilities, aircraft plants, and transport networks were struck so often that repair crews could barely keep up. Every day the war dragged on. Germany's ability to resist was eroded from above. For the crews of the Flying Fortress, the change was deeply felt. Missions were still dangerous, but the odds of survival were improving. More bombers returned home. More airmen completed their tours. The feeling that the sky itself was finally on their side began to grow. German pilots, once the hunters, now found themselves hunted. Allied fighters swept ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the skies and forcing enemy aircraft into desperate defensive battles. The Luftwaffe was slowly destroyed, not on the ground, but in the air, where it could no longer protect the Reich. The B-17 had become more than a bomber. It was now the centerpiece of a strategy that gave the Allies control of the skies. And with that control came the power to shape the outcome of the war on the ground. By the final year of the war, the B-17 Flying Fortress had earned a reputation unlike any other aircraft. German pilots spoke of it with a mixture of fear and respect. Time and again, bombers returned to their bases in England with wings torn open, engines destroyed, and holes punched through their fuselages, yet they were still flying. These battered aircraft became symbols of resilience, proof that the fortress truly lived up to its name. Stories spread quickly among air crews. One B-17 landed with nearly an entire tail section missing. Another came back on a single engine after being hit repeatedly by flak. Crews climbed out of wrecked aircraft in disbelief, knowing that only a few feet of twisted metal had stood between them and death. These were not rare miracles. They were the result of a design built to survive. This toughness changed how missions were flown. Crews trusted their aircraft. They stayed in formation longer. They pressed on through flak barrages that would have sent other bombers turning back. The B-17 gave its crews confidence that even if things went wrong, they might still make it home. For the enemy, this durability was deeply frustrating. German fighters could pour ammunition into a flying fortress and still see it struggle onward. The psychological impact was immense. The B-17 seemed almost impossible to kill, a stubborn presence that refused to leave the sky. By war's end, the Flying Fortress had become a legend, not just for what it destroyed, but for what it endured. It carried its crews through some of the most dangerous air battles in history. The success of the B-17 was not measured only in bomb tonnage or enemy factories destroyed. It was measured in the way the war itself changed. For the first time, an industrial nation was being systematically defeated from the sky. The Flying Fortress and the crews who flew it had made air power a decisive force in modern warfare. As Allied armies pushed across Europe, they encountered a Germany already weakened by years of aerial bombardment. Fuel shortages crippled tanks and aircraft. Supply lines were broken. Factories struggled to produce even a fraction of what they once had. The battlefield on the ground was shaped by battles that had already been fought high above it. The psychological impact was just as important. German civilians and soldiers alike knew that there was no safe place left. The skies belonged to the Allies. Every day brought the threat of another raid, another wave of bombers that could appear without warning. This constant pressure wore down morale and resistance. For the airmen who had flown the B-17, the end of the war brought a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Many had survived dozens of missions against impossible odds. They had watched friends fall, aircraft vanish, and entire formations disappear. Now, at last, the sky was quiet. The flying fortress had helped deliver victory, not by conquering territory, but by breaking the enemy's ability to fight. It had turned air power into a weapon that could decide the fate of nations. When the war ends, the B-17 does not simply fade into history. Its impact reshapes how the world understands air power forever. Military planners, engineers, and future generations of pilots study the flying fortress as the aircraft that proved strategic bombing could decide the fate of a global conflict. No other bomber of the era carries the same weight of legend and consequence. The lessons of the B-17 flow directly into the design of future air forces. Heavy bombers become the backbone of Cold War strategy, capable of carrying weapons that can reach across continents. The idea that control of the sky can determine victory becomes central to modern warfare. Every long-range bomber that follows carries a piece of the flying fortress in its DNA. For the men who flew it, the B-17 remains something far more personal. It was the machine that carried them through firestorms of flak and swarms of fighters. It was the thin line between survival and destruction. Long after the engines fell silent, veterans remembered the vibration of the wings, the roar of the propellers, and the endless blue of the high-altitude sky. Museums display the aircraft today as relics of another age, but they are more than metal and rivets. They are monuments to a moment when ordinary people climbed into extraordinary machines and faced the full violence of modern war from the air. The flying fortress did not just help win World War II. It changed how wars would be fought forever, proving that sometimes the path to victory lies not across the ground, but high above it. Behind every B-17 that returned safely was another that did not. Tens of thousands of airmen lost their lives in the skies over Europe, many of them still in their teens or early 20s. They faced dangers that no training could truly prepare them for, flying again and again into some of the most heavily defended airspace ever created. Each mission carried the risk of sudden death. A single flak burst could tear through a cockpit. A single fighter attack could set an engine on fire. Crews often watched friends vanish in explosions or spiral helplessly toward the ground. There was rarely time to mourn. The next mission always waited. For those who survived, the emotional toll was immense. Many carried the weight of what they had seen for the rest of their lives. They remembered the faces of men who never came back, the empty bunks in the barracks, and the sound of engines that meant both safety and danger. The B-17 story is therefore not only one of technological achievement, but of sacrifice. Its victories were paid for with human lives, every factory destroyed, and every enemy supply line cut came at a cost measured in blood and loss. Yet despite this, the men who flew the flying fortress believed in what they were doing. They believed that their missions were helping to end a war that had already taken too much from the world. And in that belief, they found the strength to climb back into the sky. The war in Europe proved something the world would never forget. The sky had become a battlefield as important as any land or sea. The B-17 flying fortress had demonstrated that bombers could reach deep into enemy territory and reshape the course of a war from above. After 1945, no nation could ignore that lesson. Air forces around the world were reorganized with strategic bombing at their core. New bombers were designed to fly farther, higher, and faster, carrying weapons that could decide the fate of entire nations. The legacy of the flying fortress was written into every blueprint and every flight plan that followed. At the same time, the technology behind the B-17 helped drive civilian aviation forward. Advances in engines, navigation, and aircraft structure found their way into peacetime flight. The skies that had once been filled with bombers would soon carry airliners, connecting the world in ways that had once seemed impossible. The flying fortress had helped to open this new age. It was a machine of war, but it also pushed humanity further into the era of global air travel and modern aviation. Its influence extended far beyond the conflict that created it. In this way, the B-17 became more than a weapon. It became a turning point in the story of flight itself. Long after the guns of World War II finally fall silent, the B-17 flying fortress refuses to disappear from history. While other weapons fade into forgotten archives, this aircraft becomes something far greater than metal and engines. It becomes a symbol of an entire generation that fought a war 6 miles above the earth, surrounded by cold, fire, and death. Across the United States and Europe, surviving B-17s are slowly restored and preserved. Their aluminum skins still bear the scars of flak and machine gun fire. Bullet holes remain visible. Panels are bent and warped. These are not imperfections. They are proof of survival. Every dent tells a story of a crew that faced overwhelming odds and made it home. When people walk beneath these bombers in museums and airfields, they are not just looking at a machine. They are standing beneath a flying battlefield. Each turret, each gun mount, each narrow hatch reminds visitors how cramped and dangerous life was for the men inside. There was no room to escape fear, no place to hide, only duty and trust in the crew beside you. For the veterans who flew these aircraft, the flying fortress becomes something deeply personal. It is the place where friendships were forged under fire, where young men grew old in a matter of months, where laughter, terror, exhaustion, and hope existed side by side. Many crews stayed together long after the war ended, bound by experiences no one else could fully understand. Stories of crippled B-17 limping back across the channel become legend. Bombers returning with engines destroyed, wings shredded, tails nearly blown away, yet somehow still flying. Gunners firing until their guns jammed. Pilots fighting to keep their aircraft in the air with barely any controls left. These are not myths. They are recorded in mission logs, photographs, and survivor testimonies. The flying fortress becomes the embodiment of endurance. It is remembered not for elegance or speed, but for its refusal to die. Even when damaged beyond what engineers believed possible, B-17s kept flying and kept their crews alive. Today, as restored bombers roar into the sky for commemorative flights, the sound still stops people in their tracks. It is the sound of history, a deep, steady thunder that once filled the skies over Europe and carried thousands of men into the most dangerous missions of their lives. The war ended decades ago, but the B-17 flying fortress still flies, not only through the air, but through memory, through history, and through the stories that will never be forgotten. The impact of the B-17 did not end when the last bombs were dropped over Europe. When the war concluded, military planners around the world studied its design, its missions, and its results with intense focus. They were not just analyzing an aircraft, they were examining a new way of fighting wars. The flying fortress proved something that had never been demonstrated so clearly before. Air power alone could cripple an enemy's ability to fight. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, submarine pens, and industrial centers had been systematically targeted from the sky. The B-17 turned geography into a vulnerability. No nation was safe simply because it was far from the front lines. This realization reshaped global military strategy. Air forces were no longer secondary branches that supported armies. They became independent, decisive instruments of war. Nations invested heavily in long-range bombers modeled on the lessons learned from the B-17. Larger payloads, greater altitude, longer range, more defensive firepower. The blueprint of modern strategic bombing was written by the Flying Fortress. The B-17 also redefined the relationship between technology and human endurance. It proved that aircraft could be built not only for speed, but for survival. Armor, redundant systems, multiple engines, and self-sealing fuel tanks became standard. The goal was no longer simply to reach the target. It was to bring the crew home. Every bomber that followed, from Cold War giants to modern strategic aircraft, carried a piece of the Flying Fortress in its design philosophy. The idea that aircraft should be able to absorb punishment and keep flying came directly from the experiences of B-17 crews over Europe. Even in peace, the legacy remained. Air shows, museums, and memorial flights kept the fortress alive in the public imagination. For younger generations, it became a gateway into understanding the air war, a tangible reminder of what it meant to fight thousands of feet above the ground with nothing but thin aluminum between life and death. The B-17 did more than win battles. It changed how wars would be fought forever, and its shadow still stretches across every bomber that flies today. When history looks back at the air war over Europe, no aircraft stands more clearly at its center than the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was not the fastest bomber. It did not carry the largest bomb load. But it was the aircraft that made the strategy of daylight precision bombing possible, and that alone changed the course of the war. Before the B-17, the idea of sending bombers deep into enemy territory in daylight was considered suicidal. Fighters, flak, and interception would destroy unescorted aircraft long before they reached their targets. But the Flying Fortress rewrote that assumption. With its heavy defensive armament, armored crew positions, and 4 powerful engines, it could fight its way to and from the target. And it had to. Over Germany, B-17 crews flew into some of the most heavily defended airspace ever created. Black flak clouds filled the sky. Fighters attacked from every direction. Aircraft were torn apart mid-air. Yet formation after formation pressed forward. Even when planes were burning, damaged, or losing altitude, crews stayed in formation to protect each other with overlapping fields of fire. The B-17 became more than a machine. It became a flying community. Crews depended on one another not only for navigation and bombing accuracy, but for survival. A lone bomber was a dead bomber. A tight formation was a fortress of steel, guns, and courage moving across the sky. And slowly, relentlessly, it worked. German factories were hit again and again. Oil production collapsed. Aircraft plants were shattered. Transportation networks were crippled. The Luftwaffe was forced into a battle of attrition it could not win. Every German fighter that rose to stop the bombers faced dozens of machine guns waiting for it. By 1944, the air war was being won not by surprise or speed, but by endurance. And the B-17 was built for endurance. When Allied armies finally landed in France and pushed into Germany, they did so under skies that had already been conquered by the flying fortress. The ground war moved forward because the air war had been won. That is the true legacy of the B-17. It did not merely bomb Germany. It broke Germany's ability to fight.